Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and I'm here with Reed Hepler, and we are looking at the week in AI. It is May 28th, 2024. It is a Tuesday. Our goal has been to do these on Fridays, but we had some conflict. So this is kind of 2 weeks in AI that will cover last Friday and this coming Friday. So, Reed, feels like it's been a busy period of time. I don't know that that's necessarily going to slow down. Maybe it will, but there was so much in the news. Um, Maybe we could start by we've just released libraryrobot.org. Do you want to talk briefly about what that is?
Yeah, certainly. So libraryrobot.org is a podcast is a basically a pod or a suite of library related tools for librarians and educators that it can help librarians and educators find books, find subject headings, create library programming, all sorts of things that AI can do that can assist librarians and others in being more effective. We also, there's also a search engine query optimizer, so it can help you find the best keywords in Boolean terms to help refine your searches, and you can use those to help patrons. These are free of charge, so show them to your patrons, show them to your colleagues. We're just really trying to kind of help bridge the gap between human abilities and AI um, abilities to create usable AI assistants. So, do you want me to share my screen and kind of show this stuff, or do you want to just kind of, we have
No,
released it, it will be available.
yeah, I'll go look at it. I mean, there are a couple of things to say about it. One of which is this is based on, or it will be free based on OpenAI's widely releasing ChatGPT 4.0, because currently to have access to the custom GPTs that we used to build it, you would have to have the paid plan.
Yeah.
But so you can test it out now if you have the paid plan, but very shortly it'll be available for those with that access from ChatGPT 4.0. The other thing that it represents, I think, a little, and we'll talk about this more later, is that it's kind of a shift from having to code, right, to do prompt engineering, to having that sort of done for you in the background so that it's easier to interface with the chatbot on specific tasks.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about Google featuring AI in search. So I think you put that in our agenda. Tell me what you were looking at.
So Google, and this is interesting because you're just talking about having an interface where the chat can be helpful, and this is an instance where it definitely is not helpful. And this is kind of talking about that the right use of AI versus the not right use or an improper use of AI. So Google, instead of having a search engine be your first resort of you looking at information, they are having an AI tool be the first thing that you read. So it automatically goes to Google. And I think this is kind of their mirror of Microsoft's Copilot or Bing, where if you would search in the search engine and then you scrolled upward, it would automatically query their AI. Well, Google took it a step further and it's automatically querying the AI before it's giving you search results. And it's emphasizing the search results if it isn't thinking that it can give you a satisfactory answer. But the things that it's counting as satisfactory answers are kind of ridiculous. So um, there are search questions about like how can I have my cheese stick on my pizza, and it's saying to mix the cheese with non-toxic glue and then put the glue on the pizza. They also said how can I have more minerals in my diet, or how can I have a healthier diet, and it's actively responding you should eat rocks, and eating rocks will help your diet. Another one that my brother-in-law found is that you can basically like what is the best, because he wanted to cook spaghetti on gasoline because my in-laws and me now are big campers and we wanted to cook spaghetti while we're camping. So how can I use gasoline to cook spaghetti? Because whenever they tried it, it hasn't been working well. Well, it said you can't use gasoline to cook spaghetti, which is wrong. I mean, technically it doesn't taste good to me, but it's wrong. You can use gasoline to cook spaghetti. But what it said was you should mix the gasoline in with your spaghetti sauce and it will make it taste better. And I was like, people are going to try these out and they're going to get sick and then they're going to sue Google, all these things. I mean, it just goes back to information literacy. You using the tool for the right reasons or the wrong reasons, and using it for an information resource, as we talked about last time, is very bad. So just so many issues with with that. And you have um, a bunch of ideas. I think we talked last time about your idea that it's not a logical tool. It's based on what the language and communication, right?
I'm interested, right? Because Google is one of the premier players, the presence here. And
Mhm.
so to use large language models in a way that would indicate accuracy feels like it's part of this great confusion, right?
Mhm.
That large language models aren't actually factual, but we're pretending that they are. And so, they're designed to build rapport with you. They're going to mirror back the kind of writing that you do. They're based on this large amount of trained data, which, some of it is cultural, which may or may not be factual. Some of
Mhm.
it is, clearly not right. How somehow it's using the language model to produce advice that's wrong.
Mhm.
Why do we think that? Is there a public perception? Is there a perception by the tech companies that large language models are factual rather than fluent?
Mhm. Well, and it's interesting because if you look at the things that it's doing and that Google is trying to do, it's very obvious, at least in my mind, and I could be completely wrong, but this is the result. It's acting as though the AI is a keyword search. And so it gets the keywords spaghetti, gasoline, and cooking, and then it doesn't look for results. It just puts those in there and says AI tool put spaghetti, gasoline, and cooking into a configuration that makes a lot of sense. And so it's like this weird Boolean search that doesn't really turn up anything. They're basically using it wrong and they've trained it wrong, is what they're basically trying to say, how would a human put this? Just put it into a sentence. It's not even querying the websites. It's just hackneying a phrase together that it thinks is correct.
Okay,
So,
well, we'll surely talk more about this.
yes.
Do you want to go to Copilot plus laptops?
Oh, yes. So this is interesting on another level. So Microsoft this past week, in fact, I think it was on Thursday, released Copilot Plus laptops, and this means that, I mean, logically, they're going to make laptops that are infused with or integrated with Copilot. You can't remove the Copilot, but the plus side is you don't have to pay now for a subscription to Copilot. It just comes with the laptop completely, and you don't have to even pay. Every user on that laptop will be able to use Copilot. It is a item. It is a device-based Copilot instance, and so that solves a lot of the subscription problems that a lot of people were saying. I can just have my laptop and as Copilot, and I don't even have to have a subscription to Microsoft Copilot. But there are significant issues with this. With Copilot and with Bing and Microsoft in general has always tracked their user data, and they've always used it to make sales. And this is kind of a thing that they do. But now, then they've said this now, they released this, and it was only after people prodding them. Now they're going to track not only what you search for with your Copilot, but they're going to track the keystrokes you make. They're going to track the apps you use. They're going to track what websites you go to. They're going to track when you do these things, and they're going to use those to inform their Copilot AI companion for you to track it, and then they're going to use it to train other AI, like Copilot in general, kind of use that data. So they're going to track even more of your data. Now it's not just the sites you use or what queries you do for the online Copilot tool, it's how you use your physical laptop. And they're tracking that and they're not going to let it go. So massive data privacy issues. Of course, if you opt into this, I mean, you're going to be okay with it. But for people who aren't okay with it, there's no option. It's either we track everything or you don't get that capability. So
So I mean, you've talked before about the fact that if let's say you're grading student papers and you use ChatGPT to upload the papers, you don't actually have permission from the student to put that information into ChatGPT's training data. Now you can turn it
right.
off,
Yeah,
but at
no.
the same time, like you have said, we don't really know if it really gets turned off. I mean, obviously they've collected it; they're just promising not to use it. So
Yeah,
there is this question of comfort, ease of use versus privacy, right? So we
yeah,
give up a certain amount of privacy in order to have comfortable, easy things.
yes.
But I think what I hear you saying is this is giving up a lot.
Yes, yes. Much more than anybody ever has. I mean, we've been able to track websites and have our websites tracked, but our keystrokes, our apps, the file names we create, everything about like our desktop is now going to be used to train an online tool. So yeah, all sorts of things like that.
Well, and it goes along with some news this last week of the intelligence agencies kind of detailing how they're buying publicly available data. They're calling it publicly available, but it's private corporations that have tracked your data. So if you're using an app and you go to these different locations, it's tracking your geolocations or it's tracking something else. So the idea that this information is going to get hoovered up and you don't really know who's going to use it is a very real issue.
Yeah.
Okay. So ScarJo is gone. The Scarlett Johansson like voice, which it's not clear that it actually was, but it's gone. So that was sort of, I've heard people refer to that moment, the big Monday announcement from OpenAI, as being their iPhone moment, right? And for me, it was. I mean, sort of watching the interactions, the emotion of the voice. As we've talked about, I had difficulty with the movement of ChatGPT toward companionship rather than more kind of encyclopedia robotic responses. But it also shone a light on OpenAI's business practices, right? So there was an admission that there had been contact with Scarlett Johansson to try and use her voice as recently as 2 days before the reveal. And then Scarlett Johansson sends a couple of letters from her lawyers saying, even my friends and family think this is my voice, or they have difficulty distinguishing it. And I need to have transparency on how you created this voice. And OpenAI's response was, well, we used an actor to get the voice, but we're not going to reveal who that is for privacy reasons. And it all just smelled bad. It smelled funny, right? And so I left that feeling like, wow, okay, I'm not sure I can trust OpenAI. It felt like if they were trying to get her approval 2 days beforehand, then they knew what they were doing. And we've talked about this, so we don't have to review in total. But then there were some pretty significant departures from OpenAI and some disclosures from people who were working there that the team that was overseeing the safety and trust weren't getting the resources they needed, and now is probably gone.
Yeah.
So,
definitely.
Yeah. Any comments on that?
Well, it kind of underscores the idea that we're going to, and we might talk about this later, that people are rushing to make profit off of these things, and they're skipping over all the ethics. They're skipping over all the important things that you need to be thinking about when you're making a tool that's going to be used as widely as this one is. And I was listening to, well, whenever I work from home, and even in my evenings, but especially in the mornings, I turn on the Stanford HAI YouTube channel, and I listen to that on my headphones as I'm, mowing the lawn or whatever. And they talked about that the academic world and the corporate world are kind of drifting apart, and they're trying to keep the connections between those. But they're but some of these professional companies, and they're trying really hard not to say Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, are kind of abandoning the academic underpinnings and the scientific underpinnings and the research underpinnings of the artificial intelligence field, and they're just taking all of the commercial aspects of it, like being able to emulate people's voices, and rushing it to production, rushing it to release things, and not thinking about the consequences of these things. And so this kind of underscores just the fact that there needs to be some self-control, or maybe external control, but I prefer just some self-control. They shouldn't have ever released the voice, or they should have been transparent. I mean, this whole thing would have been fixed if they said, oh, this isn't ScarJo's voice. We never insinuated it was, really. But the fact that we're not being transparent about the actress, if she exists, the actor, if they exist, is kind of a red flag to me. I think if they would have released the voice and released the person and said, hey, it's this person, there would have been much, much less pushback about that. But
yeah, there's a book that has been highly influential in my life called What Technology Wants by Kevin Kelly. And the truth is, this is a rush the prophets, like you said, and it's a huge technology. So there's a reason why it's happening so fast, and it's so game changing for everybody, because those who have dominance are likely to really benefit for the long term. The problem is that this is also an extremely unknown technology. Is it dangerous? Well, it certainly is on some levels. the ability to mimic voices, the ability to scam based on that, massive amounts of information. But is it dangerous even beyond that if we're talking about artificial general intelligence, and we don't really know what will happen if an AI actually gains sentience and is decision making independent of humans? So it does feel like this would be a moment you want to be really careful, but at the same time, it's understandable. If you're OpenAI, you're probably pushing the boundaries, because if you don't, someone else will. That doesn't make me.
Issue. Yes, yeah. You don't know what other people are going to do, what ethical boundaries they'll adhere to and what ethical boundaries they won't, or legal or other boundary. But you don't know, so you have to kind of guess and go ahead with whatever you're content with skirting a little bit.
Yeah, we're going to get into this in some more depth in a few minutes, but there is this way in which the Scarlett Johansson moment showed that we are likely to be highly influenced by a recognizable, compelling voice, and that it moved from independent robotic information to sort of companion-like emotion eliciting responses. E.O. Wilson, who wrote the famous book on sociobiology, said, "The real problem of humanity is we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies." And I feel like that quote became enormously important in the last few weeks as we look at the potential for AI. Okay, so in other news, OpenAI started to pay for, or at least publicize that they're paying for, access to certain kinds of content. I think they made a deal with Reddit. I believe there was another news outlet that they made a deal with. This is interesting, right? Because you and I have both sort of believed that, like when a human being reads material and then later draws upon that reading in order to produce content, that you're not breaking copyright by reading that material. At the same time, if that material is behind a paywall, like it's a paid book, it would make sense that you would need to pay for it, and that the use of it by an AI is significantly greater use than by an individual. But what about content that's just freely available on the web, right? So if I'm right about this being Reddit, that's just content you could look at. And so paying for it does set kind of an interesting precedent.
Yes, and that is interesting because what are they paying for? If you can access it but just by web crawling, which theoretically you could, and theoretically there may be ethical issues, but legally and in my mind, if you can see it on the web for free, you can use it to train things because it's freely available. But are they paying for clicks? Are they paying for user data? Are they paying for comments of those posts and the context of that kind of the metadata? There's issues with that. News Corp, which is the news company that they were paying for, they have Wall Street Journal, they have New York Post, they have Financial Times, I think, or maybe that was a separate deal, but I know the Financial Times is in that. They're paying for that as well. All of those are freely available. Well, maybe Financial Times isn't, but Wall Street Journal is available. New York Post is not. So basically, essentially, yeah, you're right. They're paying for a subscription to that content, but I have to wonder, what else are they paying for on that website? I think they might be paying for user metadata as well.
Yeah, that gets back to our other issues about how much are we really comfortable with an omniscient, all remembering system that can know so much about us, and especially then predict our behavior based on sort of psychographic kind of categories of what we do and why we do it. And it's not like OpenAI has been very open about how they have trained their data. So again, in the absence of being more disclosing about it, it does give pause. Okay, I want to describe something that I've done this week that was just stunningly valuable to me. So when I was in high school, I was an exchange student in Brazil. I learned passable Portuguese. I pretend to myself over the decades that I still speak passable Portuguese, but I don't. But I still remember phrases and I can understand a fair amount. So I used ChatGPT to become my language tutor in Portuguese. And I basically used the prompt and said, hey, I want to practice my Portuguese. I want to practice at a beginner level. I want you to be my personal tutor. And it's stunningly good. It's not just that it somehow kind of figures it out, but that same compelling thoughtfulness that makes me so nervous about the Sky Voice debacle is really helpful with the language learning. So if I don't say it right, it doesn't give me harsh correction. I could probably even ask it to give me a correction in a lighter form if I wanted. I did ask it to slow down. I said, hey, I need to speak more slowly. But I've been having in my car 30 to 40-minute conversations in Portuguese with the AI. And I'm like, well, if I were trying to pay for this with a private tutor, it would cost me a fortune. And here it is for free.
Yeah. That's that, and that was just the regular. That was the non-authored, non-fine-tuned chatbot.
Well, I was using. I mean, I have paid for ChatGPT, so I think it defaults to 4.0 for me. I don't know that I'm actually getting 4.0. That's not been clear because what I'm getting is the same thing I got some weeks before 4.0 was announced. So I'm not sure that there are very clear distinctions about what you're getting, but it didn't sound like the Sky Voice from those demos, but it's nicely inflected and thoughtful, and it does feel very close to talking to a person.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, who knows what will come when 4.0 is released, because you're gonna have free access to all those fine-tuned things. But even for now, the base model is pretty good. Is really nice.
Okay, so let's do some deep dives.
Okay.
And do you want to do the open source models as a part of a deep dive? Should we just jump into that?
Yeah, sure. So this image, or I guess I'm not going to show you the image. It's really hard to see it, but it's from Arena ELO, and they rate closed and open weight models for research purposes. And they released an image a few weeks ago. It's on Ethan Mock's LinkedIn. A lot of if you just search Arena ELO closed versus open models, then they'll come up with this image. And it is a chart from March 2023 to May 2024 of the progress and the capabilities of these different models. And you see that there are and they don't really do the best about labeling their axes here, which is something that I mean they have their x-axis labeled, their y is not as nice, but they have these capabilities, and for whatever metric they're using over here in March 2023, the gap between open source and closed is basically it's 200. And then if you go over here to May 2024, the gap between these is something like we have like 50, 280. So it's something like 180, 150. And so there is still a gap between the open source models and the open weight models and the closed source models, but that gap is slowly decreasing. And of course, you have at the very top of these things, you have GPT-4o is the top open weight model, and the top, closed source model, and the top open weight model is the Llama 370B, and I'm sure that the Llama 4 8B would be the top if it were in this chart. But you can see that although open weight models are still below closed source in terms of ability, I mean, right now, the open source model of May 2024 is above the capability of GPT-4 when it was released a year ago. And so yes, it took about a year to close that gap, but it still did close the gap, and that rate is going to decrease. And so it could be that the open weight models become significantly closer in parity to closed source models. I'm hoping certainly that'll be the case. People are very pessimistic about that fact, but I think that open source models are going to become stronger in terms of text analysis and text generation and the appropriateness of their response to queries and prompts. And therefore, my model, and I'm sure that any of you who have followed my work, and I've talked about this in conversations with you, and I think I talked about this last time, that I love open source and free AI tools and kind of the equitability of using generative AI tools. And so this is really nice to see that that gap is closing slowly, but it is closing. It may not be ever completely removed, but they are becoming more capable, much more capable. So
This is going to be really interesting. I want to follow this conversation as we move forward, and I hope you'll continue to be talking about this, because in the software world, the open source model produced some things that we just took for granted at a certain point in time, like the Apache web server, right? So it was like this whole idea that there were open source creations that facilitated all kinds of abilities that we depended on. But also the commercial companies are going to look for ways to maintain some financial benefit from offering their services. So, in a lot of ways, I still know people who use OpenOffice or running Linux on their computers, but not many. And so I'll be really curious to see how this evolves, because I'm guessing that there are benefits to a technology like this being open, especially if it has the dangers that we think it might be having, or it might present. So, okay, well, I hope you'll keep us up to date on that.
Yeah,
Do you want to talk about the symmetrical power of AI in assessments?
So this is an idea from David Wiley, who he has his own blog, opencontent.org, and he released this. And I actually, on my blog, it's readhepler.substack.com, collaboration, which is a portmanteau of AI and collaboration. Anyway, he talks about the idea that if an educator, or let's say if a manager assigns a task or an assignment to a worker or a student, basically, if they create something with AI, then the student or worker can fulfill that assignment or that task with AI as well. And so basically saying, like, if you create something with AI, you can fulfill it with AI. And it kind of speaks to Ethan Mollick's concept of a possible world. He's not advocating for this, but he's saying we could go to a world where something is created, assessed, integrated, acted upon, and reported upon all by AI tools. And there could be very little human input. If we're going the way that we continue to go, we could go into that. And that kind of is related to the idea of human agency, kind of keeping the human in the loop, having a human look over these things. And I talked about this in my first blog post, and I did a blog post again, like I said, on the symmetrical power of AI, that humans need to be working with the AI tool. It can't just be automation. If you try to automate everything, first of all, it's not going to work because they're awful at automating things, especially things that require a lot of context and emotional context and things. But if you collaborate or integrate with it, and I would prefer collaboration, you need to be actively engaged in something, and you'll create something much better if you collaborate with AI than if you just had the AI automate the task. And I would suggest that unless you're willing to put in a ton of work, and I mean that's always a good thing too. And you can create something with AI that will match or exceed your best efforts in a fraction of the time if you use it correctly. And so the emphasis here is that, and if you go to his blog and read it, he has a list of items and a list of assessment types. And the later items in the list require more active engagement, creating presentations, creating, full-fledged papers, creating websites. They require more active human engagement than the earlier ones, just multiple choice exams or short answer questions, and they're better assessments in my view. And so you need to keep in mind that when you collaborate or use AI, you need to have your own engagement. You need to have your own goals and have your own efforts in there. Automation, as people are wanting to do, will not have effective will it have effective results? No, not near as much as if you collaborate with the tool and actually work with it, and you are at the head of at the head of the process. That's kind of a fear I have, is that a lot of people will just say, "Oh, the AI can do it." Well, it can, but it can't do it well, and you won't have nearly as many good insights or nearly as many actionable things, aspects as you would if you actually collaborated with it. So that's my rant on that.
Yeah. Okay, so this is going to be really interesting as well, because Ethan Mollick's book is well worth reading, the
Yes.
co-intelligence book. It talks a lot about sort of the accomplishment level of people using AI versus not using AI, and the differences in the low achieving and the high achieving. One of the things, and this is a little bit meta,
Mhm.
and we can save it for the ongoing conversation, but whatever that oversight function is, someone's going to try and build an AI to do that oversight function.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Precisely.
Again, that gap will close. And so there is a really interesting question about what are the human attributes that are going to make overseeing the AI more valuable, or collaborating with the AI more valuable. So we'll keep talking about that, but I think it's going to be very interesting, because um, if I didn't read the article,
Mhm.
but this idea that if you give the assignment, if you create the assignment using AI, then you should allow AI to be used for the assignment. Is that the core of the symmetrical argument?
Well, and he and I've talked to him repeatedly about this in personal conversations. His idea is that you should be banning AI from the classroom. They should be able to learn how to use it and collaborate with it. But his idea, he's kind of speaking to the idea of, I should be able to use AI to create my assessments, but it should be banned from the classroom because students will never learn how to use it ethically. And so he's saying, if you can create something, kind of like if you build it, they will come. If you create something with AI, they will be able to, not necessarily that they can or they should, but they will be able to do that with AI. It will be, if you can create an assignment to write a 3 paragraph description of something, an AI will be able to do that. And so he's arguing that basically you shouldn't be blind to that possibility that they can and will use it. I'm saying yes, they can, but they need to be engaged, and you need to model and teach them how to be engaged while they do that. So anyway,
So the first part of that is a consistency argument.
yes,
You know, don't create an assignment using AI and then tell your students you can't use AI. Just
yes,
this
yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
make sense. But on the other side of that, which is more compelling to me, is this is a tool, and we have to figure out how to use the tool, and we better be helping our students figure out how to use the tool, because telling them not to use the tool doesn't make any sense to me.
no, yeah,
Meaning, I use the tool actively. I get in long conversations. There are ways in which, if I watch a movie and I see a nuance in the movie, it's
mhm,
shockingly helpful to me to ask ChatGPT, "Am I the only one that noticed this scene?"
yeah,
And no, a lot of people have noticed that this creates a tension in the movie that would otherwise not be there, or something like that. And it's got access to all of the reviews of that movie, that the reviews that people have written. And so it's an incredible tool. And the idea that you would ban it from educational use doesn't make sense right off the bat for me. But
mhm,
there is a lot of discussion to be had about how you do that.
yeah,
And again, you know my phrase, which is the solution to the problem of generative AI in education is generative teaching.
mhm,
So you should be teaching students how to use the tool to help them become better learners.
mhm,
Okay, so let's talk about AGI,
mhm,
artificial general intelligence, UBI, universal basic income, and the talk and fear that is going on right now. I mean, I'm hearing, everyone from Elon Musk and Sam Altman to others say, we're going to have artificial general intelligence within a year,
mhm,
and 5 at the most. And then I'm hearing other people say, get ready, physical labor and intellectual labor are both going to be dramatically impacted, and there are going to be large numbers of people out of work. So we need to have a way for there to be some form of universal basic income. This conversation could go in a lot of directions that don't relate necessarily to the AI,
mhm,
especially the universal basic income, because that taps people at a very deep kind of political, emotional level of
mhm,
what is the best way to provide for people who don't have work,
Mhm.
right? And how important is work in your life? But let's just talk about AGI. Uh, and how close are we to the singularity? What do you think?
I don't think we are necessarily close to the singularity. Um, was it you or was it somebody else I was talking to? And he was like, I don't believe in a singularity. I believe in multiple smaller singularities of, kind of like you're talking about how impacts of AI on specific fields, and they're going to change specific fields, but then we're not going to ever have an AGI singularity in general. I don't know if we're never going to have it, but I think that there will be certain that I don't think we're going to have it anytime soon. I think we would have to have much more detailed and much more complex computers and and machines to have that soon. I think you might have it in 50 years, but who knows? But I mean, 10 years ago, you would have never said that this was possible, what we have right now. So you never know. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. This is going to be very interesting, and especially because uh, I'm not sure we really understand how our own brains work, right? And so the idea that the arising of sentience or the ability to make decisions is going to be a fascinating discussion to watch, because I feel like I'm going to learn a lot about how we make decisions and how we're built and how AI is built. So
Yeah.
the larger societal questions are going to be very real, I think, because we have this sort of Star Trek vision of the future where we've figured out energy, and we've figured out money, and we figured out all kinds of things, and so everybody lives in sort of a relatively peaceful way,
Mhm.
versus the Mad Max concept of things break down, and then all of a sudden you have great inequities, and you have violence, and you have other troubles.
Mhm.
I think we're gonna have some really interesting discussions, because there will be very serious questions, and it goes back to that E.O. Wilson quote, right?
Mhm.
We were built for a very different age, right, than
Mhm.
the sort of industrial intellectual world that we live in. And so what will we learn about human nature as we go forward? Um, it's very clear to me that AI, regardless of a singularity or artificial general intelligence, it's going to know way more than any of us know individually.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Because
there's going to be
it's
an
uploading all that
incredible,
data into it.
yeah. And
Mhm.
so even if it's not sentient or aware, we're going to be able to ask it to act as though it were sentient, and it
Yes.
will produce responses for us. And so everything from weather forecasting to economic policy to political movements are going to be highly impacted by what may not necessarily be artificial general intelligence, but the use of AI by humans in that way. They
Mhm.
will
Yes.
ask it to act in that way.
Yeah. Which is kind of a scary thing because it will, because it's only beholden to its creators or to its users, and so that's the fear of maybe not necessarily because you're talking about you're not going to be replaced by AI, you're going to be replaced by a human using AI, and so even if you don't reach a singularity point, we could reach a point where humans reach that threshold where they're willing to use AI to do kind of the dystopian like things that we're fearing of AGI. So I kind of fear more the humans who are going to control it rather than AI itself. Because even if the AI doesn't gain, complete sentience and rule the world, world leaders can still use it for similar ends potentially once it reaches a certain point.
Yeah, and I'd be very curious to know to what degree currently AI and supercomputers or quantum computers are being used for things like economic policy or for um, like investment purposes.
Mhm.
I think it's BlackRock that had one of the first big supercomputers, and my guess is that a lot of their investments have been related to the kinds of analyses that could be done by high-level computing that an individual wouldn't have access to. And
Yes.
so the accumulation of the financial resources, the decision making around this, whether or not it's actually sentient, there will be sentient people using it in a way that mimics sentience of the AI.
Yes.
There's a movie called Lucy with Scarlett Johansson, coincidentally, where she's developing her brain power, and a professor says to her, "I'm not sure that mankind is ready for it," which is the greater ability to use our brains. We're so driven by power and profit. Given man's nature, it might bring us only instability and chaos. And that's another quote that sat with me this week, which is, the history of the world is a history of power and control. And we may have aspirations for much better ways of living with each other, but the truth is that power and control have largely dominated. And I think it's because of our nature. And so this is an arena in which you and I and many others will probably be watching closely to see how does this play out in the world of AI. Okay, I want to propose that there are two core dilemmas that I see.
Okay.
One is, are we building something like us or something different? Right. So I don't think that we're very truthful about how we work as human beings. We kind of pretend that we have perfect remembrance, right? That our brains are this computer-like machinery and we have perfect remembrance, and we don't. Sometimes it's hard to remember what happened the day before, or we can have very different views or different memories than someone else of what happened. We've talked about this, right? So we have emotions, and they're very legitimate questions about why do we have emotions and what's the purpose of them, right? And so are we building something to be like Sky with ChatGPT, or are we looking for something that's more logical, that's figuring out facts, that's reasoning and determining actual factual data? So I think that's a core dilemma. And do we want our large language models to be factual and trustworthy, or do we want them to be like us? Thoughts?
Well, it's interesting because in some ways we do, and in some ways we don't. You were talking about, and we talked about this a little last week, that AI is not logical, it's not factual, it's based on language communication, and we like that, I think, because we don't want something to be hampered by ethical things or by what's true, but yet we ask it for things, and so we want it to be true, but we don't want it to have all the aspects that come with all of that truth, all the ethics, all of the guardrails, all of the privacy things. We want something to be that is rational, that is logical, but we don't want all the things that comes with that ration and that logic. And so we settle for something that just spits out whatever we think, and we call it rational, but it's not. But to that end, human content is largely what the AI is specifically. Well, really, all it, because all of the text generators have been trained on human generated data. Reddit, like you were saying, websites, and so we're going to get something like us with all of our, foibles and all of our fallibility. So in the long run, I think we want kind of a chimera of rational, logical, but we really don't want it. We want something that's going to just fulfill what we want in the moment. So we want something that is rational, but we're getting something that spits out whatever it thinks we want, and we're calling it rational. We're saying that it's ethical, but it's really not. And I think that is kind of because of a shift in kind of the paradigm in artificial intelligence in general. The field about 5 years ago, one of the researchers in the field said, we're going to be able to create an AI machine that can replace radiologists within 5 years. No radiologists will have to be hired. And then later after that, they said, well, do we really want to do that? Or do we want to do something that's going to make radiologists more effective, that just analyzes data and spits out facts and spits out, what radiologists should do and makes them more effective? And they kind of opted for the latter. And that was one of the reasons that Stanford created its human-centered AI department, and that program was they wanted to keep the human in there. And so I think that corporations want something that is just that fulfills their needs. Academia wants something that's rational, logical, ethical, all of that things. And then the consumers, we don't know what we want, really. Sometimes we want ethical, sometimes we want rational, sometimes we want something that can just analyze the data we give it and get back to us and then shut down. So I don't know.
Yeah, it occurs to me that policy requires consensus.
Yes.
Technological advances don't.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a difficulty in establishing guidelines and guardrails for what we're looking for,
Mm-hmm.
because it's such a harder process than a technological advancement.
Yes.
The technology happens. We're like, okay, so yeah, somebody's going to take it and use it. Whether it's TikTok or Snapchat or Instagram, once the technology is capable of producing a response from us or time and attention, right, it's going to get used. The policy decisions can take years to sort of sort out, and the consensus may never arrive.
No.
Okay, so I feel like that's a dilemma, right? Which is that basic dilemma of, are we building something like us or something different? And maybe history shows that we will choose convenience over privacy or over rationality often, just because we live in our own little micro worlds where things need to get done.
Mm-hmm.
So dilemma number 2 for me is this rush to profit, right? Which is, we've talked about this earlier, that it's going to be very hard to have thoughtful dialogues about the impact of these technologies when they're happening so fast. Mm-hmm. Because they changes so quickly. And again, that's that Kevin Kelly, what technology wants concept. So those feel to me like the 2 big dilemmas that I'm kind of playing with. Mm-hmm. Maybe to close out, what if we talked just briefly about the progression of generative AI? Right. So this idea that we go for, like, library robot is sort of the next stage. You don't have to craft the prompt, but you can get the information you need because someone's created a little bit of a tool to do so. These custom GPTs. Mm-hmm. So first there's the kind of hacking prompt engineering. Then there's the customized custom GPTs and custom LLMs. Right. So large language models specifically trained on a certain set of data. And then there's in that regard would be medical and financial, large data sets. And there was a fascinating story out about somebody who's created an AI tool to interpret babies' cries. Are they hungry? Are they uncomfortable? That these can actually be trained to map, which doesn't surprise me at all.
No, that makes sense.
Brain imaging as well. So, and then there's the stage of integrating into other products. So the Microsoft suite of products, a Canva now, or what's the Adobe? What's the big publishing program? Adobe. No, whatever these. No, I'm sorry. It's for creation stuff. Adobe Photoshop.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so is that Adobe? That is Adobe, right?
Yes, yeah, it is Adobe. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so the integration of pretty sophisticated AI tools within those platforms. So if that's a reasonable progression, do we come to the conclusion that we're thinking of AI now as these discrete little modules, but it's really just going to be integrated into almost everything that we do?
That's the issue. That's the question, and it kind of harkens back to when I went on my little spontaneous rant about we don't know what we're asking about when we're talking about AI. Some of us want the whole comprehensive, massive tool, and some of us want it discreetly. But whether or not it's a massively product thing, like GPT-4o that can do like 50 different types of outputs, or it's AI is integrated into every single thing we have, kind of the result is a little bit the same. It's a little bit different, but it's a little bit the same, especially if you integrate all those little things together. Who knows? I don't know if we're going to, have our baby monitor analyze our baby's cries and convert them into brain images, and then we can combine that with our shopping cart AI to say, oh, you need to buy more of this for your baby because your brain, your baby AI says this. I don't know. That'd be really interesting to kind of create like a quasi version of a singularity where you have your little home, like it's like a home product system of AIs, all the AIs talking to each other. So yeah, who knows? I think it might do that. That'd be really interesting to have like a little home network, because we have home assist. We have I have a Google Home assistant that kind of is speaking through in every room of my house, and I can tell it, go turn on this in the office. It could be that way,
I wonder if it's not a little bit like the refrigerators that automatically know how much food you're consuming and then can order the
Yes.
food for you. I have no interest in that. It's like, okay, that's not really going to help me because that's not a real sticking point for me. But I wonder if there is a lesson from the degree to which science fiction has always predicted advancements coming much faster than they actually do. Meaning we're human. We live day-to-day lives. We live with other people who are as imperfect as we are. There are all these ways in which our lives are not super efficient necessarily, and efficiency may not be the thing that we fully want. So I wonder if there isn't some degree to which a lesson from the world of science fiction might be, this isn't going to happen overnight. We're not just going to wake up and be in some sort of sterile environment in which the computer makes all the decisions for us. Right? It's much more likely that there's some combination of Mad Max or maybe Blade Runner or versus Star Trek.
Yeah.
That there's going to be a degree to which these things happen unevenly over the course of time in different ways, and then they'll settle out into products and services or things that help us that we've actually wanted to have help us, or that take advantage of sort of our cognitive, social, emotional needs in a way that makes them compelling. Okay, so anything before we do a little quick wrap up? Anything else to talk about in that regard?
I think that's all. Yeah.
So we have the ChatGPT bootcamp for ChatGPT plus AI bootcamp for libraries and librarians that starts this Friday, May 31st. On June 27th is our Teaching and Learning with AI conference. So teachingandlearning.ai. And the ChatGPT Library Bootcamp is at library20.com. And then next month in July, we're going to be doing an AI for personal and professional growth bootcamp. So this is an opportunity for individuals to really drill down on using AI for their own personal and professional growth. And that will probably be 3 sessions in July. Yeah. Okay, Reed, always interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, for having me. Yeah. Talk to you next week.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.